What happens when a top prosecutor becomes the victim of the system she fights to protect? The afternoon was alive with the hum of a busy downtown street in Charlotte, North Carolina. Sidewalks bustled with shoppers weaving in and out of storefronts, some clutching cups of coffee, others pushing strollers or holding children's hands. Among them walked Eleanor Lewis, a 72-year-old woman with a dignified presence. Her soft grey hair framed her face, and her sharp, almond-shaped eyes missed nothing as she moved purposefully toward her car, a small tote bag slung over her arm. Eleanor wasn't a stranger to these streets. She had spent decades here, serving her community in ways most didn't fully realize. Today, however, her routine was interrupted. She hadn't noticed the squad car idling by the curb, its windows rolled down just enough for the officers inside to keep an eye on passers-by. She didn't know they were watching her. "Excuse me, ma'am." The sharp voice came from behind her, breaking through the sounds of honking cars and footsteps. Eleanor turned to find a tall police officer, his expression a mix of suspicion and authority. He gestured toward her tote bag. "What's in the bag?" Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the sudden confrontation. "It's just some groceries," she replied, her voice calm but firm. She held up the bag for him to see. A loaf of bread, some fresh produce, and a bottle of water. But the officer wasn't satisfied. His partner had joined him now, standing just a step behind. They exchanged a look, then the first officer's tone hardened. "We received a report of a shoplifting incident nearby. You match the description of the suspect." Eleanor's eyes widened. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. Her words were steady, but a flicker of disbelief crossed her face. "I haven't stolen anything." The officer didn't waver. "We'll need to check your bag." Around them, a small crowd began to gather, their whispers carrying disbelief. People fished out their phones, a few already recording. Eleanor handed over her tote bag, watching silently as the officer rummaged through it. When he found nothing but groceries, he frowned, then gestured toward her. "We're going to need you to come with us." Eleanor took a step back. "What for? I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice louder now, clear enough for those nearby to hear. The crowd murmured in agreement, a young man shouting, "She didn't do anything!" But the officer's decision was made. He grabbed Eleanor's wrist, pulling out handcuffs. "You can explain yourself at the station." Eleanor held her ground, lifting her chin as the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "I'm telling you, you've made a mistake." Her words cut through the chatter of the crowd, but the officer didn't hesitate, guiding her toward the patrol car. The crowd grew louder, phones held high as Eleanor was forced into the back seat. But the officer didn't know one crucial detail. This wasn't just any woman. This was Eleanor Lewis, the state's chief prosecutor. And soon, he'd learn just how wrong he was. The patrol car pulled away, its sirens silent, leaving a trail of confusion and indignation in its wake. Eleanor sat in the back seat, her wrists uncomfortably bound by cold steel. She kept her gaze steady, refusing to let the officers see the simmering frustration beneath her calm demeanor. Outside the car, bystanders exchanged looks of disbelief, their phones still aimed at the retreating vehicle. Inside the station, the officer whose nameplate read Officer Bradley Turner escorted Eleanor through the bustling precinct. The room was alive with the sound of ringing phones, clacking keyboards and muffled voices. But Eleanor's entrance seemed to draw eyes. Perhaps it was her composed expression, or maybe it was the distinct air of someone who didn't belong in such circumstances. Officer Turner led her to a small interrogation room. The grey walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and a lone metal table with matching chairs gave the room a cold, uninviting atmosphere. He gestured for her to sit. Eleanor complied but said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. "Name?" he asked, flipping open a notebook and clicking his pen. Eleanor met his gaze, her voice steady. "Eleanor Lewis." The name didn't register with Turner, and he didn't look up. "Do you know why you're here?" "Yes," she replied, leaning slightly forward. Because you've made a mistake. Turner's pen hovered for a moment, but he quickly dismissed her words. You match the description of a suspect in a theft case at Mason's Market. Black female, grey hair, wearing a light blue coat. He pointed at her attire as if to punctuate his point. Eleanor glanced at her coat, then back at him. And do you typically make arrests based solely on descriptions that vague? Turner ignored her question, his tone becoming more clipped. The store owner identified you as someone who left without paying. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And did this store owner provide any evidence? Security footage, perhaps? Or is this all based on assumption? Her calm yet pointed questions seemed to rattle Turner slightly. We'll look into that, he said curtly, avoiding her piercing gaze. As Turner left the room, Eleanor sat back, exhaling slowly. She could hear muffled conversations outside the door, but the words were indistinct. What she did know, however, was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, back at Mason's Market, the situation had taken an interesting turn. The real thief, a younger woman wearing a similar blue coat, had been apprehended by another officer just blocks away. A store employee reviewed the security footage and quickly confirmed the mistake. The woman who had been arrested earlier was not the culprit. By now, the videos from the downtown incident were already gaining traction online. Clips of Eleanor calmly defending herself while being handcuffed had sparked outrage. Comments flooded social media, condemning the officers and demanding accountability. The hashtags #justice for Eleanor and #mistaken identity trended within hours. At the precinct, Officer Turner received a call from his colleague at Mason's Market. We've got the real suspect, the voice on the other end said. Turns out the woman you brought in isn't involved. Security footage confirms it. Turner's grip on the phone tightened. You're sure? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Positive, the voice replied. You need to let her go. Turner hung up, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He walked back to the interrogation room, his steps heavier than before. When he opened the door, Eleanor's sharp eyes met his, and for the first time he hesitated. We've verified that you're not involved in the theft, he began, his voice lacking the confidence it held earlier. You're free to go. Eleanor rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. And the apology? She asked, her tone cool and measured. Turner blinked. We acted on the information we had. Eleanor's expression didn't change. She simply nodded and walked past him, leaving the room and the precinct behind. But the officer's troubles were far from over. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather. News crews had arrived, their cameras trained on the station's entrance. Activists and community members held signs, chanting for justice. When Eleanor emerged, the crowd fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause. She acknowledged them with a slight wave but didn't stop to speak. She had other plans. Back home, Eleanor sat at her desk, reviewing the footage and statements that had flooded her inbox. As the state's chief prosecutor, she knew this incident went beyond her personal experience. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a system that too often acted on bias rather than evidence, and she intended to address it. But Eleanor also knew she needed to tread carefully. The courtroom would be her stage, and her words would hold weight far beyond this single case. She was preparing for a reckoning, and it would be one the officer would never forget. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, and community leaders sat alongside concerned citizens, each wearing an expression that ranged from curiosity to indignation. Officer Turner adjusted his tie nervously as he stood by his lawyer. The defendant's table, usually a place of composure, felt unusually tense. The judge entered, his gavel striking sharply against the block to call for order. We are here today to address the incident involving the wrongful arrest of Ms. Eleanor Lewis, he began, his tone neutral yet firm. Turner's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client acted on information provided by a credible source. He had no intent to cause harm, and the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, cutting him off mid-sentence. All heads turned as Eleanor walked in, her presence commanding immediate respect. She wasn't alone. Behind her were two high-ranking officials from the Attorney General's office, their tailored suits and solemn expressions underscoring the gravity of the situation. The silence in the room was deafening as Eleanor approached the witness stand. Officer Turner's face drained of color, his confidence evaporating. He had seen this woman before, but now her full identity struck him like a thunderbolt. Eleanor Lewis, the state's chief prosecutor. Eleanor took her oath, then faced the courtroom. Her gaze swept over the room before resting on Turner. "I've come here today not just as someone who was wronged," she began, her voice steady, "but as someone who understands the responsibility we all carry in upholding justice." Eleanor's recounting of the events was both precise and emotionally charged. She described the moment she was approached, the unwarranted suspicion and the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of strangers. She spoke of the interrogation room, her treatment, and the disregard for her protests of innocence. Her words painted a vivid picture, one that left the room hanging on her every sentence. "I told Officer Turner that he had made a mistake," she said, her tone unwavering. "But instead of listening, he chose to act on assumptions. Assumptions that led to my wrongful arrest." Turner's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ms. Lewis," he interjected, "while we understand your frustration, my client was following protocol based on the information he had at the time." Eleanor turned her attention to him. "Protocol," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Is it protocol to arrest someone without verifying evidence? Is it protocol to ignore the humanity of the person standing before you?" The lawyer faltered, his words catching in his throat. The judge intervened. "Ms. Lewis, please continue." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening slightly. "This isn't just about me," she said, addressing the room. "This is about a system that allows bias to cloud judgment. A system that treats people differently based on preconceived notions. If this could happen to me, a woman who has dedicated her life to justice, then what hope do others have?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over everyone present. Turner avoided her gaze, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink under the pressure. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "I don't want revenge," she continued. "I want accountability. I want change. Because this isn't just about one officer's mistake. It's about ensuring that mistakes like this don't happen again." Eleanor's words were met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even the judge looked moved, his stern expression softening slightly. As Eleanor stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution called their next witness, the store owner from Mason's Market. His testimony confirmed that the real thief had been caught hours after Eleanor's arrest and that security footage had exonerated her completely. The footage was shown to the courtroom, the grainy video clearly depicting a much younger woman in a similar coat walking out of the store without paying. The evidence was undeniable. Turner's actions had been based entirely on assumption, and the courtroom knew it. Turner's lawyer stood once more, his tone now tinged with desperation. "Your Honor, my client regrets his actions and wishes to apologize to Ms. Lewis directly." The judge gestured for Turner to speak. The officer rose slowly, his face pale. He turned to Eleanor, his voice shaking as he began. "Ms. Lewis, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause you harm. I was just trying to do my job." Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I accept your apology," she said after a long pause. "But an apology isn't enough. Change isn't just about words, it's about actions." Her statement hung in the air, a challenge not just to Turner but to everyone in the room. Eleanor had turned a personal injustice into a call for systemic reform, and the weight of her words would not be easily forgotten. As the courtroom recessed, whispers rippled through the gathered audience. Reporters hurried to jot down notes, their murmured comments about Eleanor's poise and the depth of her message filling the air. But while the atmosphere outside buzzed with activity, Officer Turner remained seated at the defendant's table, his head lowered and hands clenched together. The reality of what had transpired finally began to sink in. Eleanor stood by a window in the courthouse hallway, gazing out at the crowd that had gathered on the steps below. Their signs and chants called for change, justice, and accountability. She couldn't help but feel a swell of both hope and sorrow. Hope because people cared. Sorrow because such incidents were still all too common. One of the reporters approached cautiously, microphone in hand. "Ms. Lewis," she began, her voice tentative, "can you share how you're feeling right now? Many see you as a symbol of strength and resilience after what happened." Eleanor turned to face her, offering a small but genuine smile. "This isn't about me," she replied. "It's about all the people who don't get to stand in a courtroom and have their voices heard. It's about those who don't have the privilege of their story being told. If my experience can spark a conversation that leads to change, then I'll consider that a victory." Her words resonated deeply, not just with the reporter, but with everyone who later watched the clip as it aired on the evening news. But the victory she spoke of felt bittersweet. For every Eleanor Lewis, there were countless others whose names would never be known. Turner walked out of the courtroom slowly, his expression unreadable. His colleagues avoided his gaze, some muttering to each other in hushed tones. It wasn't just about the embarrassment of arresting the wrong person. It was about what that mistake represented. Bias. Assumption. A failure to question whether his actions were guided by evidence or by something far more insidious. Later that evening, Turner sat alone in his apartment, staring at his uniform hanging neatly in his closet. He replayed Eleanor's words in his mind, particularly the part about actions speaking louder than apologies. She hadn't condemned him outright, but her disappointment carried more weight than any accusation could have. He opened his laptop and began typing. His resignation letter wasn't long, but it was sincere. Turner knew that stepping away from the badge wasn't just a gesture. It was a necessary step toward understanding the gravity of his actions and finding a way to do better. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat at her desk, drafting a formal statement for the Attorney General's office. She wasn't content to let this be another isolated incident swept under the rug. Her letter outlined concrete proposals, improved officer training, mandatory bias awareness programs, and stricter protocols for verifying evidence before making arrests. She knew these changes wouldn't fix everything, but they were a start. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from an old colleague. "You handled yourself with such grace today. Proud of you, as always." Eleanor smiled faintly, but the weight of the day still pressed heavily on her. She leaned back in her chair, her mind wandering to the faces of the crowd outside the courthouse. She thought of the young people holding signs, their voices strong and unwavering. They were the ones who would carry this fight forward, but she would do her part to pave the way. The next morning, news outlets across the country carried the story. Headlines ranged from "Wrongful arrest sparks calls for reform" to "State's Chief Prosecutor takes a stand against bias." The footage of Eleanor's arrest and subsequent courtroom appearance had gone viral, sparking debates on everything from systemic racism to accountability in law enforcement. Social media was ablaze with discussions. Some praised Eleanor for her courage and composure, while others criticized the system that allowed such a mistake to happen in the first place. There were heated arguments, moments of reflection, and even pledges from local activists to push for policy changes in their communities. Amidst the noise, one post stood out. A high school student named Jordan had shared the video of Eleanor's speech in court, adding a caption that read, "This is why we need to speak up, because people like her remind us that change is possible." The post garnered thousands of likes and shares, a testament to the ripple effect Eleanor's actions had set in motion. For Eleanor, the journey didn't end with the courtroom. Weeks later, she stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of law students, community leaders, and activists. Her speech echoed the sentiments she had shared in court, but delved deeper into the need for systemic change. "Justice isn't just a concept," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's a responsibility. And it's on all of us to ensure that responsibility is met with fairness, empathy, and accountability." The audience erupted into applause, but Eleanor's gaze remained steady, scanning the faces before her. She saw hope, determination, and a shared understanding that the road ahead would be challenging, but necessary. And as the applause faded, she left them with one final thought. Change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to act. It comes from all of us, doing our part, no matter how small it may seem. The sun was setting over the city as Eleanor walked home from the auditorium. Her speech had been met with standing ovations, but she knew the real work was just beginning. Change, as she had told the crowd, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistent, deliberate action. And while her story had sparked a much-needed conversation, she knew it was only the first step in a much larger journey. The events of the past weeks had left a mark, not just on Eleanor, but on everyone involved. Officer Turner, now retired from the force, had begun volunteering with local community organizations, hoping to rebuild trust and learn from his mistakes. The Attorney General's office had announced new initiatives aimed at reducing bias in policing, a small but significant victory in the fight for justice. Eleanor sat on her porch that evening, sipping a cup of tea as the distant sounds of the city reached her ears. She thought of the young girl who had shared her speech on social media, the activists who had rallied outside the courthouse, and the countless people who had sent messages of support. Each of them was proof that change wasn't just possible. It was already happening. Her story, she realized, was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or wronged by a flawed system. It was a reminder that no matter how daunting the challenge, every voice mattered, and every action counted. The world won't change overnight, Eleanor thought, setting her cup down. But it will change, one step at a time. And to you, the viewer, remember, it only takes one voice to start a movement. Speak up, stay informed, and never stop fighting for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire change.